There we go. Hi.
Hey, welcome back.
Yeah, welcome back. You wanna share what we were just talking about, where we're starting?
Yeah, I've been thinking about how I felt so much better since our last chat. It almost felt
Yeah.
like the doing opposite action of like talking when I didn't feel like talking, like being connected when I wanted to isolate, like something like broke open and I felt so much better since, which so thank
Yay.
you for holding the space
Oh my gosh, of course.
and all the listeners who check us out. I appreciate that. And I think where my mind has been like in the last week is thinking like what's been happening on my feed is thinking about the ways in which our society and we people in society police each other's bodies um, and expressions of humanity. And so I'm thinking of a couple things. Like one is um, Next Benedict, who is the non-binary teenager from Oklahoma who was bullied because their peers were not accepting of their gender fluidity, and they ended up dying based on the injuries that they sustained in the bathroom. And I was just thinking about like bathrooms, like school should be a safe place for all kids. And when a school doesn't allow um, kids to use a bathroom that is affirming of them and keeps them safe, like I feel like that's heartbreaking. And then I was also thinking about Daryl George from Texas, who's this Black teenager who was suspended from school, I think last year, for wearing locks. I have locks, and I think about like, if someone told me like I couldn't wear my hair like the way it is, that I needed to cut it. Like I would hope that my parents would support me in being able to do that. But
Right.
the school and the court said that he was in violation. And so I just thinking about like just what happens in our schools. I guess both of these things are related to school, but I think it starts at school. I think we get indoctrinated at the school level of like
Mhm.
who we should be and who's allowed to have free expression and who needs to make themselves smaller or othered. So I've just been thinking a lot about that and how it doesn't end. People always say like it gets better after high school, but like for some people it gets better. And
Right.
but we're all school just becomes work or college or
Mhm.
whatever it is, businesses, and so that's where my heart is. It's just a little bit of the heaviness of what's the role that I'm playing in this,
Mhm.
like all the little, I think about policing people's bodies at small levels, right? Like just so dress codes, who decides what a dress
Mhm.
code is,
Yep.
and like and who does that serve, who does that center. um I remember a couple years ago we moved to this town that we're in now, and my kids were both in middle school then, and we went on a tour, an orientation tour, and I remember like the vice principal was talking about the dress code, and I just I tried to contain myself. I was like, okay, you're just arriving in the school district, let's not mouth off too soon.
Let's not
uh
stop right now. But soon we're
Yeah.
gonna fuck shit up.
Yes, yes. I will give you a beat to communicate your stance on how you think the way people dress um, supports learning. And so I don't believe that, but I get that mentality and I get that approach, and different strokes for different folks, I guess. And I guess it's like, how do you do liberation where it's like different things will support learning for different people?
Right.
And so, how do we get away from this one right way?
And I think that's where I think in the past I would have entered a conversation like this and where I can touch it as a human in terms of a woman and being, and usually dress codes are most impacted by women or female presenting people, right? um but there's such this bigger part that I've never experienced. And I think in the past I would have felt, and there's still a part of me, I can feel the emotion coming up. I can feel the tears. I can feel the rage. I can feel the despair. And ultimately the hopelessness of like, what can I do? What can I do that would likely make me want to avoid a conversation like this. But one of the things I've been thinking about in terms of our conversations is I feel like it's very easy for me in here to be on a high horse. And I think what I want to do when I have the urge to avoid a topic that's overwhelming or be on a high horse about it and be like, but I'm one of the good ones, right? Is instead to just always come back to the question, how is that showing up in my own life? How am I policing other people's bodies? Like, how am I thinking or communicating to the people in my little corner of the world that there's only one right way and it's usually mine, right? Like, and so that's just, it's interesting for me to sit with and think about, because that's not a story I tell about myself. That's not a narrative, I do it. I'm sure I do it. And so just wondering about that now in the different areas of my life and how I do that or how I have done that in the past. And
Yeah. I mean, I think that's the humility of it all, right? Is I think it's easier to escape to places of I'm one of the good ones versus,
yeah,
for me also to try to be thinking about how does this show up for me?
yeah,
And I think about like as both of us are people who own our own businesses and we have employees and I work at this university where I also have, staff as well. And like for me to think about how rules or like policies and practices in some ways can reduce anxiety and add structure
hmm,
and some expectations, but then also always interrogating like, well, who does this center?
yeah,
Who can do this with ease? Is there room? Where is there room for flexibility? Um, like even a dress code, what does that mean? Like not weaponizing words like, well, it should be professional, but where does that come from? And I guess that's why this work sometimes of liberation or decentering whiteness feels never ending is because there's always more work to do. Just when you think
oh,
you've
yeah.
got it, then, another door opens and you're like, oh, yeah, I haven't really thought about that, or I've been complicit, or I've done harm. And I think for me, the dance is how do I have conversations with staff about what would be supportive? And at the end of the day, I have decisions I have to make. And can I do enough of my own work to know when I am operating from a place that's oppressive
Hmm,
versus a place where I'm like putting expectations out there and I'm not always going to get it right.
hmm, yeah, definitely. Well, and I'm even thinking about the tiny ways, right? Like I think it's easy to think about something like this or like consent. I think about this all the time. We think about like these big things as only showing up in these big ways, like the horrific examples that you shared, or even like as a business owner, what kind of policies am I going to have in place? But I'm thinking about this morning my son woke up. Well, he had stomach pain last night, and we hoped he'd sleep and feel better. He didn't. He woke up still with his stomach bothering him, but he wasn't vomiting. He didn't have diarrhea. He didn't have a fever. And I think part of my personal deconstruction work and liberation work has been like I see him communicating about his body differently now. Before, I saw it as my job to, in this particular instance, that he goes to school, that I define the criteria with which he should stay home and the school to some extent, right? Like fever, he's got to be fever free for 24 hours, can't puke, all these things. And now I'm thinking about it differently, and it's causing some internal conflict with my husband about like, does he get to stay home just because he tells us he's not feeling well?
Mm.
Are we going right? And like, so this is just I say this not obviously to compare between these different kinds of policing that we're talking about, right? There is no comparison between the horrific things happening marginalized folks and my very privileged son. But it was a different conversation this morning with my husband about like, we don't get to police his body. And if he tells us he's not feeling well, our only job right now is to believe him. And we don't have to forecast all this fear about what that means if he wakes up tomorrow. And are we setting a bad precedent? Like, that's a future problem. That's a problem that it does not exist and it's based in fear. All we have to do is believe him, because it's not our job to police his body. And I think I wanted to say that out loud because I didn't make that decision this morning because I said, our job is not to police his body, but it was just this deep feeling of discomfort about like, we're going to send it, that it just didn't feel right. And now that I'm thinking about it through this lens, it's like, that's why all this stuff that seemed so basic and foundational is starting to shift now. And I hope our listeners can like think about these tiny moments and how these things can play out in even the tiny moments, not just the big ones, right?
Right. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And I think that's a great example about like, how do we teach bodily autonomy and like people connecting to their bodies and how their bodies are talking to them as early as possible. And we can still be supportive and their frontal cortex and all the ways that we help guide them. But like, how do we get people to trust their bodies and respect their own bodies, and then getting them to respect other people's bodies in all the different ways, right? There are all these ways I think we don't respect each other's bodies. So whether that is when we start to get more sexually intimate, right, is like, how can we respect other people's bodies and the ways in which they experience pleasure, or the ways in which they're letting us know what they want or don't want. And yeah, I think about how much our society like values conformity, I guess. And I'm like thinking about like, I appreciate talking about white supremacy culture, but I also never want to weaponize it because I think it's not the end all be all. Like, I think that there's a lot of ways to talk about the ways in which we restrict people. But I guess I think about how much school encourages people to conform, right? And what happens if, what would it be like if we allowed there to be expectations or rules or whatever to a point, because that breeds, I guess, some level of safety.
Right.
But then also some kids are never feel safe at school. And so like, how do we care or how do we encourage like people to, what's the word? It's not digress. It's like be disruptive.
Yeah.
Right. And disruptive in a like challenge the status quo.
Right.
Like
just diverge, right? And if diverge and if that is disruptive, then like, so be it.
Right.
It causes an issue, so be it. But like, just how, like, you don't have to be like everybody else.
Right.
Yeah. I know. Well, and even you saying that, how schools in particular are such powerful systems when it comes to conditioning and indoctrination and like, this is the way and it must work for everybody. Right. And that's even a helpful reminder for me, because that happens on every level. I think it's not just like to there. I think everybody falls to some extent, because I was all hot this morning based on an email I got back from somebody in the school, in my son's school system, who's supposed to be his advocate. And when we met with him in person, was an advocate, we did feel like he understood us. And I don't want to think about sides, but we felt understood and affirmed by him when we were in person. So then I sent an email, CC'd him to all the teachers, expressing what had already been expressed. And he took a very different response in email form when all of the teachers were involved. And I've been feeling so angry about it and started to slip back into like us versus them. He's not on our side, etc. Right. And this is a really powerful reminder of, if there aren't sides, there's just a system that is powerful and doesn't work for a lot of people, but we're all in it and we all are affected by it, and some
Yeah.
more than others, clearly. But like, so how do I bring some honey back into these communications, so that I'm not firing up everybody else's nervous system, so they don't see
Right.
me as others, so that we can find, so right, schools are very powerful,
Yeah.
powerful systems in terms of spreading that message of
Mhm.
oneness and sameness. And
Yeah, absolutely. Especially I think I think, as we learn more about neurodiversity, like just thinking about the ways in which I love seeing people who, are overtly expressing, their ADHD or their autism or like sensory stuff or learning disabilities. And the more I think that that community and their allies are vocal, and like the more hopefully like liberation will come
yes,
into our culture, where we're not asking people to mask, like to conform to
right,
neurotypical ways of being, because we recognize, one, that that's oppressive, and two, they bring gifts and abilities
that's
that
right.
we are missing out on by trying to limit how they express and how they learn.
That's exactly right. And isn't the same true for all of these different like identities or groups that we identify with or are a part of, right? Like, the more people on the LGBTQ spectrum, who are not gender conforming, right, feel like they get to be who they are, dress how they want to dress, like makeup or no, whatever it is, the more people just get to show up exactly as they are, that inherently challenges the status quo, that inherently, like without having to say a word, their bodies and the express and how they use their bodies, that whatever, that challenges the status quo and is does make a lot of people uncomfortable, right, or has the potential to. but
Right.
but there's it's such a beautiful and sometimes dangerous path to liberation. So
Right. Yeah.
yeah,
I think that's where I get stuck sometimes, is thinking about, how do we spread this this view, right? That like how do we work towards liberation, that people can show up as their authentic self?
right,
Um, which doesn't mean you cause harm to other people.
no,
Other people might feel uncomfortable, but that doesn't mean you're unsafe. Um, Without it needing to resort to violence,
right,
right? It's like, how can I say, well, I don't agree with you, or I don't like that. Like I might think that in my head, but like, how do I not then move into bullying? How do I not move into like
mm-hmm.
violence? Because I guess I think about all the ways that like these little slights, these little microaggressions are on the continuum with like the overt violence, like the
Yeah,
homophobia, the transphobia, like
mm-hmm.
all of those, like racism,
Yep,
sexism, misogyny, all the
all
stuff.
of them.
And, I've been, last couple of months, I've been watching the show that's been around for a long time. I just never watched it. It's called Blue Bloods, which
No,
is
no,
it's like a CBS show that is what I like spent most of my life not watching CBS, like primetime CBS, because it felt like it wasn't created for me. It felt like it was created
mm,
for like white, middle class, working class, like what I would call like middle America, but like it's totally like me being an East Coast person who like lumps like a whole part of the United States into this thing. But it's three generations of cops. Um,
hmm,
and so what's fascinating is, we talk about having proximity to people who are different. So in my life, I know very few police officers. Like I have clients maybe who are police officers, but like I have like it's not, I don't come from a cop culture. So I don't have proximity. So it's like, okay, how do I get proximity to this part of society? So through TV. So what's fascinating watching the show, it has like 13 seasons. So I'm like in season 7. Um, and and it's a very white show, and they're talking about different generations of policing, right? And it started in 2010. So it's interesting to see as
That,
the conversations around policing have evolved in the last 12, 13 years, how the show has evolved, but it's very much a working class white police mindset where rules are like paramount, and you see a lot of, minority communities that are often communities of color, the more urban center. It's based out of New York. So what's interesting for me to wrestle with is like, where can I find bridges? Like, I don't believe in all that you're saying, but like, where do we have commonality? Because it could be so easy because I don't have proximity to other to say, like, because I think a lot of what we talk about, some people say that's like the liberal bubble, right? And so I'm trying to get proximity to other people who like feel threatened by these ideas that we're talking about,
right.
right? Where rules are helpful, where religion, this is an Irish Catholic family, right? Like, so like there's they have Sunday dinner and they pray, and like there are priests in here. And so it's kind of like someone who's agnostic, right? Who's raising kids who are agnostic and atheist, right? Like, so trying to think, there's this whole other part of the US that is very religious, that feels comfort in their morals and their values and their rules, and life is simpler in the binary, good, bad. Like, so trying to get, how do we get proximity to the thing that is not us so that we can build the bridges? Because now it's harder for me to other because I'm like watching this family of characters, right? Like, and I'm like, they're good people trying to do their best. And yet, if we were to sit together and have dinner, it would be like we would be
right
bumping up against each other because I don't know. I mean, there's a role for policing, but I'm like more abolitionist at this point.
right.
And it's like, I think we need police officers, but I think we need to do it differently.
Yeah, of course.
So it's like but like, how do you get those different people in a room together?
Right. And the thing that I'm always coming back to in terms of like, what can I do? Because right, so much is needed on a systemic basis, that I think to facilitate. But the thing that I always come back to when we have these conversations is, if people had the ability to self-soothe a little bit more, and then the curiosity, if we were somehow able to facilitate curiosity and combine that with self-soothing, like,
right,
there's like that, I feel like that, because it's like the minute we hear something that doesn't line up with our worldview, right? It's like it happened for me this morning. This is a human thing, right? Soon as we hear something that like rubs us the wrong way or doesn't align with our values or whatever we disagree with, we get fired up. And like, if we stay in that place of fired up instead of pausing or, like breathing or whatever, then we're just stuck there. And then we've got all these systems that keep us there, right? Because the algorithm then, so we're like, oh, I'm going to go on social media, and the algorithm feeds us all these stories that do align with us, and we just get more fired up, and oh yeah, gosh, it's hard though. That's what we're always talking about. It requires like so much like intentionality to know when you're fired up, and then pause and be like, maybe I'm missing something. Maybe there's something for me to learn. Maybe there's something for me to think about. Like,
yeah.
Yeah.
It's interesting. It's hard for me to know like how much of it is cultural. Like, is curiosity a thing that we all have the capacity for? I would think yes. But like, I don't tend to be curious about things that I don't have much interest in.
Yeah.
So, especially if I think I have it figured out. And so how do we encourage that? Because like, does school encourage curiosity, or is that a class thing? Like, is that like, I guess it feels like different schools teach in different ways. And like some, like I think of like more working class neighborhoods, my sense is they teach more for conformity. They teach more for like follow the rules, versus like maybe people who are in more like upper middle class or wealthy areas. Like it's more about dreaming and like
Yeah.
deconstructing all of these. So like how much of it is
Yeah.
like class and race intersecting?
Yeah.
And
That's interesting.
and so then like is that part of white supremacy culture, like this white middle class values on some level? And I guess I feel like sometimes like the liberal conservative polarity of liberals sometimes appearing condescending.
Yeah. Oh
uh,
God.
right, and so like
Oh
how could it be easy to shut down if you feel like you're being talked at, right? Like it feels like on one side it's like we're trying to save your soul,
yeah.
and then on the other side, I don't know, it's just it's so hard, so complicated.
So hard and so complicated and so worth like the thinking about that. Yeah, that's a really interesting point that you brought up. I was just listening to I think a podcast where the woman on there, I think it was a neurodivergent podcast. And this woman had become this like incredible advocate for the neurodivergent community based on her and her son's experience, right? Um, and she said something really interesting that I haven't been able to get out of my head. She talked about she really wanted her son to know there's nothing wrong with you. Like you're beautiful, you're awesome, like you have so many skills and strengths, like blah blah blah. This isn't like your fault. We're not having like problems because this is like your fault. The other thing she said though is or that she talked about is like, but I don't want you to be mad at the systems either,
Hmm.
because that creates an us versus them. And I think she had a sibling or something who went, who just had something horrific happen to him. And she felt like it was informed by his hatred of the system and like his resentment of the system.
Yeah, and I'm like, be rageful at the system, but can you do it without hostility? Can you do it with still compassion? Can you
And
understand it's all, maybe she's just packaging it differently
yeah,
than I would package it, but we're getting to the same place.
I mean, talk about a challenge, right? Whatever group you place yourself in, conservative, liberal, whatever, like somewhere on this, whatever, like to not to feel okay about who you are, but not then be like, fuck you, system, person, community, da da da. Like, yeah, it's
Yeah,
really, it's hard to even like wrap my brain around. But this is what we talk about all the time, right?
right.
Like,
Yeah,
how
yeah.
do you ever do everything from a place of love, which doesn't negate any feelings you have?
Mhm.
Um, and how is that not packaged as whitewashed or I don't know. I don't know. It's so complicated. I'm talking in
Yeah,
circles. It's just this, yeah,
yeah, yeah.
so
I mean, I think it's like, is there room for all of it, right? Because I think
yeah,
sometimes we go into like toxic positivity.
yeah, yeah,
I'm a big fan of rage. I think rage has been very liberatory for me, but I differentiate rage is different than anger. And I think resentment is different. Because I feel like resentment eats away at one's
yeah,
spirit, vitality. And
yeah,
so like I guess it's like how do we reduce the resentment? And sometimes the FU to the system allows us to create our own communities and to
right,
create our own thing that's more liberatory.
for
And so
sure.
it's like, how much of it is how much can we change the system, and that the system takes time to change. Um, and the system doesn't always want to change. Like it usually doesn't want to change.
Oh,
So it doesn't usually want to become more expansive, more complicated. And to, I guess it's like grace that our brains like simplicity.
Yeah.
in a lot of ways. And like, we're always trying to push back against that. And I guess my grace for other people is it's okay if you want your life to be simple. It's okay if you believe in the things that you believe. It's okay if you like rules. They give you comfort. And how do we make room for the people who want something different? How can
Hmm.
all of these coexist?
Right. Right. That's right. Right. Because it's in many ways, so many of the feelings are always feelings just are, right? All feelings are valid. So right. And I'm thinking about that. It's so nice to be able to subvert systems and create systems that work better for us and to feel like we have that power and agency to do that. And it often doesn't get us out of whatever less great system we're in. So it comes back to like the both and of it, or the allness of it, right? Where it's like, how can I be in this system in a way that doesn't destroy my soul or my like life, right? Depending on what's happening, what the identities are. And also how can I continue to be with people and in spaces that empower me to show up as I am or to do what works for me, or it's that both and that always gets me. It's so
Yeah,
hard.
yeah, yeah. And how can we really embody and live into celebrating differences and honoring differences versus like, is it just a human thing that we are scared of difference? Um, and is there a way that we can like really appreciate difference that actually brings creativity and like innovation and like enriches our life versus us being afraid of what the
Mm-hmm.
differences bring?
Yeah, yeah, yeah. It that when you say that, I feel some like happiness or like lightness return, because I do feel like I see so much more of that in the world and more of that in my own life. And I can feel like some of the progress we're making. We still obviously have like light years to go, but I think about the difference between Pride Month now and Pride Month 15 or 20 years ago, right? About how my business does February and Black History Month, differently now than 8 years ago. So it's like I can take some, I guess, pride perhaps in my own journey and in other people's, and because I feel like there's progress, and that's a nice thing to remember. Sometimes
Yeah,
like that, you know.
yeah, absolutely. And even like I appreciate the activists who say that that part of the progress is the backlash, right? It's like
Yeah, that's right.
and the doubling down and trying to like almost like go backwards in terms of
Yeah,
progress, like that is because something is being uh, disrupted
yeah.
and they're trying to like go back to the rules and the simplicity. And
Mm-hmm.
so while it sucks to see all the backlash and the harm of people, the harm that's occurring to people, to also remember that that is because there is all this progress that is also happening.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. Which is it's nice to be able to hold on to that, especially in the middle of a conversation where we're just the impetus for it is horrific, violent things
Mhm.
happening to people, right? So that reminder of progress is
Mhm.
needed.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Hmm.
Is this what's this feel like? Is that feel like a good place to stop?
Yeah, I think so. It feels like the both and is always a good place to be able to hold the ways we are progressing and the ways in which there's so much more work to do, and that each and every one of us has a part to play, like
Yes.
in that. And there's always more to learn.
Yeah, that's right. That's the other thing that like kind of like wakes me up and gives me some energy. it's like from retreating to that nervous system place of shutdown, right? It's like, right, there's something I can do. There's always something that I as an individual can do, something for me to learn, something for me to be curious about, a new behavior to experiment with. Like there's always something that we as individuals can do when we're feeling really powerless in terms of in face of like the giant systems. Yeah.
Yeah. And if not us, then who? Right? It's like each of
Right.
us has to do our part in making the world better.
Yeah. Yeah, that's right. And what a joy that is that we get to do
Yeah.
that. That we get to do that. We don't have to feel powerless in the face
Mhm.
of all these terrible things. Like we can do something.
Mhm.
And that matters, even if it's just us in our tiny little
Yeah,
lives doing one
absolutely.
tiny invisible thing differently. Like, yeah, that matters.
Yeah, we can build the muscle, like whatever we feel like we're lacking, like the ability to speak or how to organize, or what's
Yeah,
the little thing I can do now that will make will contribute to a better world.
that's right. That's right. I'm so glad you said that and that we're ending on that, because I think, again, in this culture where like everyone lives their lives on social media and it didn't happen unless there's a picture on Instagram
Mhm.
about it, right? Like I think it's so easy to forget that like the little invisible things that nobody else necessarily knows about, like those things still matter. Even
Mm,
though social media doesn't value those
right.
things, those things still matter. And that's a good reminder.
Yeah. And as parents, like we are powerful people in terms of what we expose our kids to, the conversations we're
Right?
having with them, because they will, hopefully grow up to be adults who also have influence. And they have
Yes.
influence as kids, right? Like in terms of how we care for each other, especially the most vulnerable among us.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. I love that. Love that.
Mm.
Always
Well,
so good to see you.
same. Yeah. So keep listening. Keep if you like, share, subscribe, all the things for Rest and Awaken, and happy to continue these conversations.
Yep. Absolutely. Thanks for listening, y'all.
Take care.
Bye.